Greetings, this is Harad Navar, and welcome to Gobbocast episode 18, Monsters. We're going to interview Bob Settles today. He is the PvE game designer for Goblinworks on Pathfinder Online. If you've been watching the Twitch Adventures with Bonnie, you've been seeing the alphas trying to beat down escalations. There's been some questions raised about that, and we're going to address those with Bob to see where escalations are coming from, where they're going, especially when EE starts, and after the Great Catastrophe, and on into OE. Hopefully you'll enjoy the information he has to provide. So without much more ado, Bob Settles. Bob, thank you for joining us today. It's really gracious of you to give us your time from the Goblinworks effort to talk with the Gobbocast today. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to Goblinworks?
Okay, I'm Bob Settles. I joined Goblinworks about February this year. I've been working in the games industry for roughly 20 years now, something like that. I've worked at places like Bungie, Microsoft, Quicksilver, 2015, variety of places. Basically, I was looking for a new job a while back and saw the posting for Goblinworks, and it looked a lot like the work that I had done on Myth 2 at Bungie. And so I took a look, came in and talked to the guys, and it felt like a good fit. I'm very interested in the PvE side of games, so I felt I could make a good representative there for that type of stuff. And like I said, joined in around February. So. Cool.
Well, glad to have you. It's always nice to give our Gobblecast listeners some context of the people we interview. I appreciate that. Now, if people have been following Bonnie's Adventure Time with Bonnie on Twitch, they know that the alphas have been trying to beat down escalations recently, especially since you upped the alphas and upped the escalations to try and test that out. Can you explain for us, especially those who may not have heard of Goblinworks very much, because this is going to be on YouTube, just what exactly are escalations and how they are designed to impact PFO?
Right. So the world is made up of a bunch of hexes, split into those typical D&D style hexes. And normally when you enter into a wild hex, we just launch various random monsters that appear around there. So you might have a bandit encampment or a goblin encampment or skeletons rising out of some graves, that kind of thing. An escalation cycle is when one of those hexes, in particular we have these monster hexes set aside for this, one of those hexes will generate an escalation as though some invaders have come in. So for example, the Bone Dancer goblins will come out and they're trying to raise a skeleton army. And they'll start in one of the monster hexes, and as they gain in strength, they'll spread out with tougher and tougher encounters in the area for players to fight. And they'll also start attacking nearby hexes so that they spread. Eventually, they will spread close enough that they will get right next to your settlement. So as soon as your players leave your settlement, they'll be encountering these high-level monsters instead of the usual random encounters that they would hit. And eventually, we would hope to have these, when the escalation gets close to your settlement, that they would actually start to damage your settlement or cause problems for you, like take down the amount of resources you can gather from the nodes and that kind of thing.
Very cool, very cool. You know, I've heard some comments about the alpha PvE, and as it's been escalating and getting tougher, they're commenting about, you know, are there any different ways of getting it tougher than just adding more of the same monster or a different flavor to them, or just adding tougher monsters? Can you tell us exactly how escalations gain in difficulty? Is there some way that maybe we can look at those? Are there many varied ways that they're going to gain in difficulty?
There are eventually going to be a lot more varied ways. Right now, it's pretty limited. As the escalation gets stronger, we can launch a different variety of monsters. We can have them be more dense. As the players have definitely noticed, numbers really matter. The Ustalav invaders they ran into this week are extremely tough, yes. But when you've got 35 players running into 12 knights, it really doesn't matter how tough those knights are.
No.
You throw on the kiting problems and stuff like that, and it's just not it's not as challenging as it could be. But Yeah, so we're limited right now to mostly launching tougher and tougher monsters as we go, and we can make them. We can make it so that there's a greater number of them that are launching at individual sites. We can also change the nature of the events that launch. One of the other things that happens when you're in a hex that has either an escalation source or an infected escalation hex is that we can have these events that occur, and that's where the mini map shows a little. Sort of a cross icon on one of the spots. And that would be like, the Bone Dancers right now are summoning burning and bloody skeletons to bolster their forces. So you go out and you try to destroy those encounters before those burning and bloody skeletons can come and join the main forces. And so we can launch a different variety of those kinds of things, and we can make them more or less complicated. Right now they do follow pretty much the pattern of, kill 50 of this type of monster or gather 50 of this type of thing and bring it to a wizard to deal with or a cleric to deal with, some stuff like that. We can make those more or less complicated, but they are... they're pretty basic interactions right now. We don't have a lot of options like, only if you're in this faction can you take advantage of this.
I see.
Well, any of that type of stuff.
There are no factions.
Yes,
right
we don't have any of that right now. We don't have any of the concept of, hey, the Bone Dancers recognize you as a potential ally, so they won't fight you. So you can have an event that helps them out and makes them stronger because you want them to be tough near your enemy settlements, that kind of thing.
That would be something to look forward to.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of that possibility right now. But definitely as we go, the intention is to make it so that it gets tougher because the players have more to react to in the moment. Right now, the enemy AIs are very simple. They basically attack whoever's attacking them or whoever got near them first. So we don't have a lot of it being worth your while to spread out around them in advance to trap them. They don't run away. They don't do any of those types of behaviors. And so the long-term goal is for it to feel as much like fighting other players as it could, so that you're being trained for PvP combat when you're doing the PvE combat as well. And some of that involves being able to have them react to what you do. So if you're gathering, they should be reacting more to that type of thing. Just as players could be met anywhere inside the hex. Right now, you see the monsters and they're there at that location. You can kind of try to wander around them. We need them to be wandering around a little bit more so that they're patrolling and that kind of thing. So we could have their patrols be more random. We could have them patrolling with more or less people so they're more of a threat. We could have them noticing different things. We can make them more likely to notice you when you're in stealth than they are at the beginning, that type of thing. Right now, though, it's very simple. They see you when you're within a certain distance, and they attack you.
Is that what we expect to see when EE starts, pretty much?
Yeah, pretty much. There's not going to be a lot of changes to that within the next few weeks.
I got that. Now, on the maps that Goblinworks have been giving us, we can see the monster hexes you've been talking about, but we also see the monster home hexes. Could you tell us a little bit about the difference between those two and how that comes to be?
So the thought is that we would have some hexes where a particular monster clan would always be. So you could always run into the Skullbasher ogres near their home location. And we haven't really worked out the details of how that would work right now. Some of the thought was that way, if you had started doing some of the events in one of the infected hexes, you could always kind of go over to the monster home hex and finish it off. But since that's not really guaranteed that they'd be running at any given point in time, it may not quite work like that. Ideally, we would have special events that can only happen at the home hexes, and it would act a little bit differently. The other difference there would be no matter how much you beat them back down, they would probably come back fairly quickly, so that they would always be around. But we're still working out the details on exactly how that would work out.
So you don't expect monster home hexes to be really functional when EE starts?
No, right now they're not planned. Right now everything occurs in just a monster hex. We may treat the home hexes as just monster hexes for now, in fact.
Makes it simple. Now, there's also the Badlands hexes and the Crater hexes, and I know that the Badlands hexes are there as sort of placeholders for new developments, and the Crater hexes are there for sky metal mining. Are there going to be any differences in the escalations or the encounters in those two hexes?
So we have the potential to say that certain events only occur in certain kinds of hexes. Right now, that's limited to, we have some events that may only occur in the source of an infection versus an infected hex.
Yeah.
But we have the potential to do things like say, oh, well, only in a star metal hex would this particular event occur. The other thing that would happen right now, and this kind of happens automatically, is that in those star metal and badlands hexes, we tend to have placed more encounter areas. As a result, the escalation would be that much denser in that particular area. So you would run into more encounters in that area, and it would be tighter, so it would be harder to avoid them. And it also means if you're attacking one, it would be tougher to kite around them without then running into another encounter nearby. So, but yeah, eventually the goal would be to actually set up and say, no, we're going to make so there's certain events that only occur in a badlands or in a star metal hex, potentially, you could have certain types of escalations that would only target those types of hexes. They would only want to launch in a hex that was near one or was one.
And I guess they'll also be a little further into EE than the opening, I'm sure.
Yes.
I got that. There's a lot of excitement and discussion on the threads when Goblinworks announced they were going to offer the base camps and the small holdings as things you can buy in the cash shop. Ryan posted a thing today where he talked about if you're gathering, you can actually sort of gather and there'd be a monster close to you and it may not trigger them to come attack you. But if that node was a gusher and you started using a harvesting kit, then that's going to attract them much more. It would seem like having a base camp or a small holding in a hex might do the same thing. Is there any way where you're planning on their escalations interacting with these, initially the small holdings and base camps and hopefully eventually the POIs and the outposts?
Yeah, much like what we want to do with the settlements, where when an escalation gets near it, we want the escalation to be damaging it in a variety of ways, hurting its resource gathering, potentially damaging its ratings, potentially actually even going in and hurting the buildings or stealing. You can imagine that if the goblins got nearby, they might just steal money from your settlement or something like that, take things of value, all of that kind of stuff. If ogres are nearby, maybe you have a lot less workers, and so all of your crafting capabilities are slowed down, and any number of things that we'd like to have affecting that kind of thing. And the idea there is that although you may have some desire to farm an escalation to a certain degree, at its core, what you really want to do is get rid of the escalation. You don't really want a bad escalation near you. And we'll do that a little bit by, first of all, having the escalation hurt your interests, but we'll also have it by making that there is a particularly good reward for the moment when you clear an escalation, so that you have the desire to clear them as often as possible. But so just as we want to damage the settlements, we would want to say that all of your POIs equally have problems as a result. It may be that when you're in an infected hex and you've got a POI, it's more likely to spawn attacks on the POI on a regular basis. It could just damage it on a regular basis. If your POI is particularly dedicated to helping you gather resources, you'll find that your resources are being knocked back because the idea that the monsters themselves are taking some of those resources.
How dare they?
Yeah, if you've got a small holding out there, it might get attacked. We might just damage it. We might lower your ability to use certain features that it has with it. Any of those numbers of things. But definitely the idea there is that you do not want to have an escalation around you if you've got any kind of a player structure in that area.
Well, it said that these base camps and small holdings won't be available until about a month or so after the start of EE. Do you think that that sort of functionality will be in place by then?
I think that'll probably follow after all of that kind of things. That'll be one of the sort of iterations as we go. Got that.
We talked about the possibility of having, when we get things like factions and other things, where the escalations will react differently to you. For you may be able to aid them in some way, or maybe they be even more aggressive toward you. Is there any possibility of different escalations that are close to one another coming together in some way and joining forces, or maybe even fighting each other, or joining up to actually attack something?
There's definitely some possibilities with that. We've actually already got some events, for example, that occur, like in the Bone Dancer one. I think it's in the Bone Dancer one. There's an event where Ripping Chains ambassadors are meeting with them to form an alliance of some kind. Right now, that's not actually between, say, the Ripping Chains escalation and the Bone Dancers escalation. It's just a sort of a comment that, yes, as one of them gets more powerful, they may be able to gain allies elsewhere. We've also there's a skeletal uprising escalation that's just an unexplained skeletons rising from their graves. You don't see any particular intelligence behind it. But partway through that one, the Bone Dancer shamans join up and just to increase the number of skeletons in the area, just because they want to mess with you. So we've already got some of that concept. Right now, the actual logic for two escalations getting near each other really only allows for, if they're close to each other, they'll battle each other. So if you have a Bone Dancer hex next to a Ripping Chains hex, they'll simply send strength at each other, and eventually one of them will overwhelm the other one and replace them inside that hex. So we don't have anything actually in the background that's allowing them to give each other strength or help each other out. But we try to put it in. I mean, part of the whole point of these escalations is to be able to add a lot more lore in instead of just random monsters that you're running into. Try to give a story to it all. So this is all an opportunity for us to explain some of the interactions between them. Like I said, right now there's not a lot of mechanical logic behind that, but we do, where we can, we'll throw in an event that showcases some of the interactions between the different groups.
Oh, that'd be nice. You know, in our interview with Lee Hammock, he talked about he would love to see some escalations where you can do something different than actually beating on them to actually overcome them. The example he gave was, having a bunch of plague victims moving into your hex. You got to feed them in order to beat the escalation down. Is there any sort of design gain in plan for things like that as we go on in PFO?
There's definitely a plan. Right now I'm pretty limited to. I can actually make an event, for example, where you could be strengthening a particular escalation, or I could even make an escalation that was there's plague victims and there's nothing in particular to beat up in the area that. I could basically have plague victims, and then I could have random encounters that are populated with, say, goblins who are bothering the plague victims. But I could set up the escalations so that all you can do to lower the strength of the escalation is feed the plague victims. It would be a kind of a weird escalation right now because it wouldn't necessarily... it might help to beat up the goblins, and it might not, but in the end, it's still going to feel kind of the same. But from a lore perspective, I could set that up. But like I said, I can't do anything interesting right now with factions or saying that you can only really help these guys out if you're this particular kind. And the bad, lawful evil settlement could come in and decide to actually help the goblins because they don't like the plague victims. None of that kind of stuff is in. But I could do some of the basics because the way that it is set up is that events can either help or hinder the strength of the escalation. And because of the fact that right now escalations don't really hurt anything in the settlement, none of that stuff would necessarily happen in any particular way. But you would get weird things, like if the plague victims were near goblins, they would actually start to beat up the goblins. I guess logically, I suppose that they're spreading the plague to the goblins or something like that. So maybe it would make sense. I'd have to put some thought into that. But as far as actually really focusing on making escalations like that, no, that's still a plan for the future.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the idea of having escalations fit more and expand more of the lore, because I've always been really intrigued about the Great Catastrophe. When that's going to be a really big lore event, maybe even the first big lore event in Pathfinder Online when it comes up. And I know that it's there to do the transition between proto-settlements and actual settlement mechanics. But, I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for more lore, like you say, especially if Lee still has his kick on for the Iron Gods themes, and you have a Numerian flavor to the Great Catastrophe. There might be a chance to bring barbarians or maybe paladins in at the time. But I digress. Do you actually see the Great Catastrophe having an impact on PvE? And if so, do you have an idea about where that might be going?
We've had some conversations about what we might do, what the nature of the Great Catastrophe might actually be. And there's some possibilities that it could be something that is a little bit more like an event. It could potentially be like an escalation, but most likely because it would be focused around those towers, which are not monster hexes and stuff like that, it'd be a little unpredictable. So we'd have to come up with a very new system. But we have talked a little bit about some potential ways that they themselves would be a bit of a PvE experience that could happen. And at the very least, we could release some kind of an escalation that sort of fits with that concept. So it might not actually do the thing, but we may have something along the lines of, the Great Catastrophe has unleashed some particular group that now you're going to start seeing in the escalations that you weren't seeing before as a result of this.
Oh, that's exciting. I like that. I like seeing lore coming into the game and generating new possibilities. It's really cool. Where do you, as we talk about changes as time goes on in PFO, how do you see PvE escalations and interactions, evolving beyond EE once we get into OE? Do you have any long-term goals you'd like to fit for that?
So, beyond obvious polish work to make them, them feel a lot nicer and do a lot of that kind of stuff, what I'd really like to focus attention on is trying to incorporate these escalation cycles into the settlement warfare and backstabbing and politics that's going on. Get a lot more of the stuff where one settlement can influence what kind of escalations are likely to occur at around their enemy settlements, which ones they can strengthen. Try to get a lot more of there's particular types of items that you can only really get at certain escalations that you need for particular settlement development, a lot of that kind of stuff. I still tend to be, I balk at the, let's make an escalation that you want to trigger near your settlement so that you'll be able to farm it, like I said. But that may mean that when such an escalation occurs somewhere on another side of the map, that you've got plans that require you to take advantage of it now that it exists, and that may force you to go and bring a lot of players near a settlement that you're not so friendly with. But also it may be one of those things where, hey, there's something like perhaps in a monster home hex where you can go there and you can participate in an event and steal enough, goblin treasures from there and then plant them near one of your enemy settlements and guarantee that that's a very likely escalation to occur at that one at the worst possible time for your, you're going to attack them, so you set an escalation off next to them, right in advance of that.
Because they want to get back their treasure.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's kind of cool. When the map finally expands again, do you think that there'll be another opportunity for different types of PvE or changes to PvE?
Yeah, in particular, we don't have, there's a lot of terrain types, a lot of the watery terrain types we don't have as much of right now. So as we expand, we'll be getting into different areas where you may have some very different monsters. You may have very different encounters with what kinds of activities would normally be going on in those areas. In terms of, at a simple level, right now we've tried to set up a lot of the encounters that happen in the mountainous areas, maybe more mining camps and stuff like that. If you're in the forest, you'll see more hunting camps. If you're near swamplands, you're going to see more fishing camps, that kind of thing. So similarly, if we actually had more watery areas, you might get more boat-related encounters and simple stuff like that. But you also might start to see more amphibious monsters or that kind of thing, so that we'd have a little bit more of that. And just simply as we spread, there's already been a lot of description of the Echo Woods area and Thorn Keep and Fort Inevitable and so forth, that we can start to bring in more and more of those groups. So just as you're seeing, the Skullbasher Ogres and the Ripping Chains Goblins and Bone Dancer Goblins, those are all from the original Thorn Keep source material. Mm-hmm. You might start to see source material from the Emerald Spire Sewer Dungeon showing up as we spread and get closer to that area.
People have asked a lot about dungeons since you mentioned that. And do you have any thoughts about that? Well, let me rephrase. What do you think about that idea?
I think it's a great idea. We should have dungeons. I don't know when that's going to happen. But yes, a lot of the thought on that was done before I ever joined, but it's definitely one of those things where there have been a lot of great ideas about how we can spawn the dungeons, and some very cool ideas about making it so that once a dungeon spawns, maybe you can actually take it over and it becomes a permanent part of that hex. Some other very cool things that have been thrown around. Right now, we're pretty limited to the encounters that are occurring above ground and are just spawned at particular places. But I definitely look forward to the day when we can actually start creating some smaller, slightly more crafted experiences that players can have. But we do have to always kind of focus on when we're crafting those experiences, as they have to be very replayable. Because you're likely to run into them over and over again. That's one of the reasons, for example, that a lot of the stories don't really have that much mystery to them. There's a little bit of it thrown in there of the, hey, you're kind of wondering what's going on, why are all these wolves out, some of that kind of stuff. But if we make too big a deal about it, the fact of the matter is everyone's going to know who's causing it after the first time it's happened. Yeah. So we can entertain a first-time player when it first happens. But that said, if it's, most of these things, the mystery unveils as the escalation grows in strength. Or potentially as you beat it back in strength, but that means that new players might run into it when it's already reached the point where the mystery is known. So there's a lot of unpredictability with this type of material. We have a lot of conversations about how we can, what could we do to make the encounters feel like they're growing over time as an individual encounter, not just as an escalation. But then we'll sit back and we'll go, yeah, but the fact of the matter is that most people are going to run into it once. And then even if they walk away for 10 minutes and come back, they'll never know whether the escalations, whether that particular encounter just despawned for no particular reason, or whether some people wandered along and destroyed it while they weren't looking. So no matter what, in a dynamic world like this, you're going to see things change at such a pace that you have trouble kind of picturing together some kind of story for individual spots. And it's even true with the escalations. You might show up and the escalation is already at phase 5, and so we can't really write the story with the assumption that everybody who shows up has seen phases 1 through 4 on the way. So when you arrive, it has to explain itself. So we run into that, and we're going to run into that with the dungeons, and we're going to run into that with all these things. So they all need to be contained in such a way that you can replay them, they can appear at any time, and you'll still be able to kind of fit them into the nature of what you're running into.
I presume that once you get factions and alignment stuff in, that'll make that job maybe a little easier.
Yeah, we'll have a little bit more of that, and the expectation then would be that as you've risen in faction strength, that you've seen some of what's going on inside that faction or related to that faction. My hope is that you'll actually be able to have some kind of standing with, say, the Bone Dancers, if you're of a more evil bent or something like that. But whether you can actually join them, or whether something like that, or whether that just means, hey, that means you have kind of safe passage through their areas and you're exposed to events that only people who have been friendly to the Bone Dancers can potentially do. What exactly having good faction standing with a monster does for you would be up for debate. Yeah. But yeah, having something like that does mean that the individual who has high faction rating with something has gone through some kind of series of events to do that, and thus has been exposed to them in a steady way, that we can't guarantee that just when you run into them at random, you've had anything like that.
No, I got that. I've been dying to ask this question ever since I saw the Thornkeep book. Eventually, there's going to be the iconic monster, the dragon. Have you given any thoughts about that?
We've had some thought about the nature of what escalations would be for that kind of a monster. Obviously, when you've got a truly super powerful monster, what you want to do is come up with some way that they've either got minions, or they've got the variety of monsters who take advantage of the presence of that monster, symbiotes and stuff like that, so that you can have something else going on in the area as well, as opposed to just one big monster wandering around. We've also talked a little bit about what kinds of things might attract that type of an escalation. There's been a lot of mention in the blogs about how we want the escalations that are likely to appear near an advanced settlement to be tougher and more interesting than the escalations that might occur near a starting settlement that can't necessarily handle a tougher one. But similarly, just to be as kind of cheesy, you can imagine that a dragon will be attracted by gold, and so if you've got a rich settlement, maybe you'll get taken down a peg by a dragon coming to take some of that away. So.
That's cool. I love that idea. That's great. You've been very expansive on the questions we have. Is there anything you particularly would like to tell the Gobbocast audience, or maybe someone who's new to PvE or to PFO, something that you would like to get out there among the people?
Certainly, I'd like to make clear that for everybody who's been enjoying the alpha up till now, that a lot of that's going to change. Just as basic combat's going to change. I mean, all of this kiting is going to go away eventually, and a lot of these strategies people are using will change for that. And as those things change, that'll give us more things that we can take advantage of for the PvE encounters as well. Right now, like I said, there's not a ton that we can do in terms of setting up the encounters so that you have interesting challenges as a result of going up against a particular mix of monsters or a particular placement of those monsters. But as we improve the combat system, we'll likewise be able to improve how we lay out the encounters so that you can have a more interesting experience when you run into them, so that there's more randomness to what happens in terms of they're using area of effect stuff. We actually had to tone down a lot of the area of effects for the NPCs because, well, to be honest, the Bone Dancer shamans were, blasting away at their own skeletons, who in turn would then decide that the shaman was the threat and kill the shaman. So a lot of that type of stuff's going to change. You're going to see a lot more of area of effect stuff. We've already been steadily throwing in things like you will now start to run into ogre hurlers who throw javelins and so forth, which previously when you'd run into the ogres, they were pretty trivial because all you had to do was basically kite them and you were done. Well, now they've got a little more distance stuff, and so it's a little tougher to do some of that kind of thing. But everything that gets thrown in, we'll be able to take advantage of that in the encounter layout and in the escalation stuff. At its simplest level right now, we don't really even have settlements providing any meaning to having an escalation near your settlement. Yeah. So you have no drive to get rid of an escalation. Or there's no big reward for getting rid of the monster at the end. We don't have the eventual rewards for your settlement that we plan to add in for getting rid of an escalation. So you just don't have those incentives to do a lot of that behavior, and that's going to change a lot of what your meaningful choices are. Yeah. So a lot of this stuff will be changing as we go, but we still hope to provide enough interesting stuff going on for players to keep busy and to keep getting new monsters as we can add them, and new types of treasure and all that kind of stuff. So
I look forward to that. I must admit the anticipation of EE is really building in me, and I'm looking forward to how Goblinworks really brings forth their talent and expands this and makes it such. The potential here is so great. I'm just really, really happy. And I thank you, Bob, for giving us the time today. Goblinworks has been very, very gracious about providing us access to y'all, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, great. Been great talking to you.